My name is Gene Shu. I'm an ABC. That's American-born Chinese.
What causes war? What causes conflict? What causes people to disagree? And what causes people to engage in some type of confrontation?
At the intersection between America and China, I'm concerned about the lack of cultural awareness on both sides.
You can't blame them for the way that they were educated and the way their view of history and their place in history and what they believe.
But I'm still optimistic about the future for my unborn son. Generational ABC podcasts are my conversations with my unborn son, one ABC to another, in my attempt to explain our world in context in order for him to make better sense of his world, which will be nothing like the world we live in today.
We care about our individual rights, and Chinese are generally more, we call it collectivist. Hey, little buddy, this is your father again. I think this is gonna be the last episode of what I'm gonna call season 1. This all kind of started off as just an idea. I'm becoming a father, and I was just thinking about, kind of what's important as a message for me to give to you as you are going through your life. And I think we all, as parents, want to share our wisdom with our children. But I think it's also important for us to be aware that the environment in which you will be growing up is going to be completely different than the one that I'm growing up. And when I say environment, it used to just be the environment in which you grew up, but now it's basically the world in which you are growing up or you will grow up is completely different than the world in which I grew up. When I grew up, the world wasn't so interconnected as it is today. So you will not know what it really means to not know what's going on in other parts of the world, because now everything is disseminated or transmitted in real time. And of course, that's completely different when we were more isolated from each other. And even to send a message to somebody overseas, you had to write a letter, put it in the post box, and then wait essentially maybe a week to 2 weeks before that letter arrived to its destination. But now everything is real time. It's not even just email is instantaneous. Now it's instant message and video conferencing and all of that stuff. So as I think in the next season, I'm gonna have kind of more specific topics related to what's going on between China and the United States to talk about. But right now, in this first season, it's all been just kind of like random. Whatever's kind of going on in the news, whatever I can think about in the moment. So continuing along those lines, the biggest thing going on at the moment is the trade war between the United States and China. And so I want to take this and just talk about, what causes war, what causes conflict, what causes people to disagree, and what causes people to engage in some type of confrontation or fight. And why does that happen more between certain groups of people and happen less between other groups of people? And how this would apply to, I guess, other listeners who are interested. I mean, it really is, how do you avoid conflict if you're an American? How do you avoid conflict with people coming from China? And I think it really comes down to, fundamentally it comes down to values. But then it extends to perceptions. And perceptions of what? It really comes down to perceptions of fairness. Okay? What you think is fair more than likely won't be what someone else thinks is fair. And the reason for that is because you will be looking at things from your perspective based on your own set of values. And the person on the other side, especially if that person is coming from China, will not have that same perspective. Okay, you know, Chinese people, you can't blame them for the way that they were educated and the way their view of history and their place in history and what they believe is rightfully theirs in this world. And I can, kind of empathize with a lot of the arguments that people from China would make. China over in the last century suffered a lot of kind of embarrassing situations from colonialism, which is basically countries as they're, exploring new geographical areas. The stronger countries like England would colonize less developed countries, and those less developed countries were generally countries in Asia, including China. So there's a lot of things that historically were kind of humiliating or embarrassing for China. What Western powers did to China, but also Asian powers. So the Asian power back in the last century was basically Japan. And Japan did a lot of really bad things, not only to China, but to a lot of its neighboring countries. Japan in that time period was kind of imperialist, where they probably felt that they were a superior nation, and thus they wanted to, we call it conquer or whatever you want to call it, to other countries. In that time period, they did it through war and colonialization. But, in a certain sense, America over the last 70 years has been doing something very similar. We haven't been doing it necessarily through war, even though we've been engaged in a lot of war with countries that we have conflict with, but we've tried to spread our values. And our values are obviously democratic values, Christian values, values that we think are inherent basic human rights, freedom of speech, religion, etc., etc. So because over the last 70 years, the United States of America had become so disproportionately more powerful than all the other countries in the world, mainly because the United States essentially survived 2 world wars without any damage to our territory. Okay. In fact, through the wars, we kind of expanded our territory, even though Americans generally feel that we aren't colonialist. But when the United States originally started off with only 13 colonies, we expanded across continental America and occupied territories that originally belonged to the Native Americans or the Indians. So everything ended up becoming a double standard, and that's just really, really dangerous if you start to believe your own narrative of history without really understanding how other people view the same set of events. And the really important thing is not to look at things only what's going on at the present, but to really understand historically what has happened and why certain people believe what they believe. And then, of course, with the United States and China, it's not just we disagree on a lot of historical events and what they meant. We also have fundamentally different values and different ways of communicating, and just a different culture. Generally speaking, Americans are more individualistic. We care about our individual rights. And Chinese are generally more, we call it collectivist, but it's just generally they're more family oriented, which means they'll give preferential treatment to people who are their family members first, and then people who have closer relationships, which they call guanxi. We believe a lot of that favoritism and nepotism is corrupt based on our set of values, but for the Chinese people, it's just deeply embedded in their culture. So if you cannot fundamentally empathize with a different set of values and develop the ability to look at things from a different perspective, then you will ultimately not be able to reduce conflict as much as you want, especially when it comes to your individual relationships, and especially when it comes to doing business. Now, at the country-to-country level, what's going on now with President Trump and President Xi, it'll just be interesting what happens when you're watching this video or listening to this podcast in 10 years. President Trump will no longer be president. And how he leaves office will be very, very, very interesting. It'll be a very, very interesting piece of history. And I just can't wait to see what happens. In 10 years, President Xi may still be the leader of China. And China, unless there's a major world war, China will be the largest economy in the world. So what does that mean? What does that mean for our politics? What does that mean for us as individuals as we try to kind of develop our lives, build our careers, and survive and thrive in what would be a new norm? And the norm in 5 years will be different than what it is today. And obviously, what is normal today is different than what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So it just continues to evolve. It's very, very dynamic. And so I think what's important is for me to really teach you to be able to adapt to different values and ever-changing circumstances. And that will probably give you an advantage in the new world, which will be your world, but to me, it's a new world. Okay, so I think this will be the last video of this series, which is season 1. I just want to say that this has been a great experience for me, being able to share my thoughts with you, and I just hope other listeners find value in this. And ultimately, as I'm trying to help you develop better relationships as you're going through this world, I think a lot of our leaders and a lot of people doing business in China might be able to take some valuable lessons from the things that I have to offer. All right, so season 2, hopefully you will have a name, but no guarantees. It's still very early. I think it's still 5 to 6 months before you will actually enter this world. So, but I look forward to seeing you very soon, and I love you even though I've only seen you in an ultrasound. All right, talk to you later, little buddy.
Listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or YouTube.